we live in the weirdest time period. Every day, I, I read and listen to things just like you do. And you just go, you can't make this stuff up. You cannot make this stuff up. So apparently Adidas has a line of clothing for trans women, so men, biological men who want to have sportwear, swimwear, still be a man but identify as a woman. So there's a place for the package, if you will, in this swimsuit. And Target is this wonderful chain of clothing and food is selling this stuff. It's really fascinating because in the I don't know, 70s, 80s, 90s, 70s, 80s, we had this. Well, I'll just tell you this. I got off my mission in 79 as a youngster. 78, sorry, 78. And in 79, I think it was 1979. Sue and I were just married, and I was called and set apart as a tour guide at Temple Square on Sunday mornings. And I loved it. This was prior to sister missionaries doing all those things on Temple Square, that they do such a great job. So I was a set apart missionary on Temple Square, doing the tours of the tabernacle and dropping the little needle or the pin or the nail to demonstrate the acoustics, but then also bearing testimony in the different visitor center, the Christus, and talking about Christ, talking about the restoration. It was awesome. But conference weekend was always interesting on Temple Square because this is where we'd have a lot of protests. You'd have Sonia Johnson and all these people, and they'd be chaining themselves to the gate. And those of you that might understand my personality, when our supervisors would say, "Now don't engage with these protesters. Don't talk to them. Don't do anything." Well, what does that do to a guy like me? That is immediately like a license to go talk to him. It's just in my nature. As soon as somebody tells me I can't do something, I'm like, I wonder why I should go do that. It's just, it is what it is. So I would talk to these protesters and get into it with them, and it was stupid, but I was young. Now why do I do those stupid things? It's not because I'm young. I just haven't learned my lesson. Anyway, it was a good time, and I would bring homeless people to our little apartment, and Sue would fix some dinners, and some of the things I did back in the day. It's amazing Sue stayed with me. But anyway, the more of the women's rights, women's liberation, all that movement, and it was targeted against the church, of course. Always these social justice things target against, and really most Christianity. So now this movement is where are these women? There are a few, but not as many as there should be, of women standing up saying, these dudes are taking over our sports. These dudes are taking over our swimsuits, our underwear, and it's disgusting. And I'm laughing. They're taking over our beer. It's funny how we as Latter-day Saints, we don't drink alcoholic beverages, and yet we've got to comment on this the Bud Light thing with the transitioning guy into a woman, and they went with that on their commercial, and it hasn't bode well for that brand of beer. But this trend, so the trans movement has basically taken over the say the gay lesbian, that kind of thing. And it's become so big, and nobody dares, say anything or do anything. They don't want to get shamed. They don't want to get shut down. And so these athletic events, it's just a joke. Swimming, biking, you name it. These dudes are and personally, I think some are just doing it. They're just doing it because they can. And they can stand on the podium as a woman because that's what they identify as. And I've yet to have anybody explain to me it is a transgender person. Is it just that does that include people who even biologically they're one sex, but they just want and they identify as other? Or does it have to be someone who has to be chemically changed and surgically changed? And you just get these, well, yes, of course, it's all of it, or it's none of it, or it's just whatever it is, So whatever the T is in the alphabet, it's really creating some interesting situations. And there are a few women who I wouldn't call feminists. I just call them women that are proud to be women and want to be a woman. And they see their daughters, perhaps, or even granddaughters participating in sports where there's dudes, and the dudes are pounding them. And they're going, hey, this isn't right. This is not right. And yet you see how these different movements get out of hand, and then it paralyzes. You don't dare say, because you went, well, I fought for this movement, so now I've got to fight for this movement, even though this movement is affecting the movement that I started, kind of thing. You see what I'm saying? It's good to go right back to the Bible, to the scriptures, and see that God created man and woman, male and female, created he them, and they get married, Adam and Eve, and they become one flesh. They have children, they have posterity, and then it continues on. It's just a beautiful plan, and it's simple. And we don't live in that world anymore. It's not beautiful, and it's not simple. It's crazy. It is absolute insanity. We have the drag queen story hours with young people attending, like little kids. So, the signs of the times. Next week's reading and Come Follow Me, we're going to be talking about these end time prophecies. We're going to be talking about, in the Pearl of Great Price, Joseph Smith, Matthew 1, which is Matthew 24. I don't think it was included in the reading, but we should, I think, read Matthew 45, or excuse me, Doctrine and Covenants 45. And then we have Luke 21, I believe, and Mark. But here's something I want to bring up in this video. So in our last reading, we talked about the wedding, right? The parable of the wedding and being invited to the wedding and wearing, and then the dude, the guy that didn't have the wedding garment, and and then certain people invited and they didn't show up. They were busy. They had stuff to do, and so the invitation went to other people. Well, my question is, and then this coming week, we're going to be talking about the parable of the 10 virgins as well as a few other parables. But the parable of the 10 virgins is really interesting. And we have in Matthew 45, I keep saying that, in Doctrine and Covenants 45, it says this about the parable of the 10 virgins. This is I'll start in verse 55. So this is Doctrine and Covenants 45, verse 55. And Satan shall be bound, that he shall have no place in the hearts of the children of men. That's the beginning of the millennial reign of Christ, right? And at that day, when I shall come in my glory, shall the parable be fulfilled which I spake concerning the 10 virgins. That's really key. So the 10 virgins are invited to the wedding, similar to the parable that we talked about last week of the wedding. In Matthew, is it 25 or 23? Or maybe it was 24. I can't remember now. Anyway, 22. Sorry, Matthew 22. And Jesus, the kingdom of heaven is likened to a certain king which made a marriage for his son. Now, this is interesting because we always look at ourselves, I think, as having the invitation to go to the wedding. The parable of the 10 virgins, it's an invitation for the 10 virgins to be ready to go to the marriage, Now, the virgins aren't the ones getting married. Those guests in Matthew 22, the king is having a marriage for his son. The king is God the Father, in my opinion. The son is Jesus Christ. There's a marriage. And who's invited? Okay, so who's the son getting married to? Does anybody ever ask that question? In the parable of the 10 virgins, who is Christ? Who is the groom? That's Christ. Who is the bride? And we always go to Revelation and say, well, the bride is the church. Well, then who are the 10 virgins? Who are the invitees to the parable? Well, I have a theory, and I always like putting these thoughts out because I immediately just get hammered by certain people, and it's all good. But at least I'm coming up. I've never had anybody explain it to me. There'll probably be hundreds and hundreds of explanations on YouTube. But we have the wedding, and between two people. And then we have a man and a woman, if you will, and then we have the guests invited. Well, here's my thought. On this. Always the groom is Christ in these parables, in my opinion. The parable of the 10 virgins and the parable of the king and his son getting married. The son is Jesus Christ. He's the one getting married. Now, who is he marrying? Now, if you say the church, what do you mean by the church? Is it the members of the church? That doesn't make sense then, because then that would say that the virgins are collectively a bride. The virgins aren't the bride, in my opinion. They're not the bride. If we read that parable carefully, they're not the bride. They're the guests. They're there to help the bride. Okay, they're there to be supportive. They're like the bridesmaids, right? They're the maids. They're the virgins there to support the bride. So who is the bride? Well, here's what I think. And this is, before I state this, this is this has come about from studying all this kind of stuff for a long, long time. And actually, I want to wait for just a second on this parable. Prior to the parable of the 10 virgins, Christ is on the Mount of Olives. This is Matthew 24. It's also Joseph Smith 1, Matthew 1, which is the version of Matthew 24. And then we have Doctrine and Covenants, section 45. All these are kind of describing the same things. And I think it's good to go to that first, and then I will go to the parable of the 10 virgins, as well as tying in the king and the marriage of his son and the invitation. Okay, now in Matthew 40, in Doctrine and Covenants 45, which is, I guess we could call it the inspired version of Matthew 24. There's some really interesting things. So just to set this up, this is getting to go time for the Savior. He knows his time is coming up. He's spending a lot of time on the Mount of Olives, just on the other side. So on not the Jerusalem side, but the Dead Sea side, or the Jordan River side of the Mount of Olives. So that would be the east side of the Mount of Olives is Bethany. And that's where Mary and Martha, that's where Lazarus, that's where all this took place. And it's very close to the top of the Mount of Olives. And so Christ is spending a lot of time up there, and his apostles are with him. And I might say disciples. I think there were other followers, but let's just go with the apostles were there. He's cramming a lot of stuff into them and telling them a lot of things of what's going to happen. So they're sitting on the top of the Mount of Olives. They're looking at the Temple Mount of Jerusalem. And I think there's, if you go to, we'll go back and forth here for a minute with Matthew 24 and Doctrine and Covenants 45, as well as the inspired version of Matthew 24 in the Pearl of Great Price. But Matthew 24, verse 3. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and when shall be the sign of thy coming, and of the end of the world? Now, the end of the world is an interesting thing. For me, there's like two ends of the world. There's the end of wickedness, or the beginning of the millennium, but that's not the celestial end where the earth becomes celestialized. It's when the earth goes from telestial to terrestrial. It's a state of being where Christ reigns. Wickedness is that Satan is bound for 1,000 years. He's loosed for a short period of time. And we don't know a lot about that. My guess is it'll be similar to what happened with the people in the Americas, where for 200 years they had the influence of Christ. Satan was bound for 200 years. And then the memory of that, the covenant of that, was lost at about 200 years, because all the people, all the influence had died off. The memory of it was no longer and among people, because after 200 years, it's basically over. It's similar to what we're going through with the restoration of the gospel through the prophet Joseph. It's been that long now that we just kind of go. So we had 1820, right? 1820, and then 2020. So 1820 is when we had the first vision. And then 2020 was 200 years. And you can see the effects. You can see the effects. I can see it in my lifetime. 65 years old. When I was young, it was, man, the gospel was pretty dang simple. And now it's just like, wow, you see people distancing themselves from the prophet Joseph, explaining things away. You have these weird books like Rough Stone Rolling, and I think even Saints is not that great in my opinion. I haven't read all the way through that. I did Rough Stone Rolling, but you have this kind of an intellectual, worldly view of Joseph Smith, the first vision, and the restoration as a whole. To me, this is what happened to those folks in the Book of Mormon that had the influence of the Savior being and living with them, kind of a mini millennium. It was after his resurrection. And he came and lived with them for a period of time. He taught them, he lived with them, he blessed them, and they flourished for 200 years. And then all hell broke loose. And when it broke loose, it broke loose. So I suspect after 1,000 years of Christ reigning, there's just going to be this little segment of time, probably to allow agency. And then the earth will be celestialized, and then there'll be the end of the world. It's the end of the world as we know it, and I feel fine. That to me is the end. But I don't feel that the millennial reign is the end. That's just my opinion on that. And this is where things get confusing. We actually have 3 events, in my opinion, that are talked about. You have the imminent destruction of Jerusalem by 70 AD, wiped out. Christ is talking to his apostles about that. He's talking to his apostles that you guys are going to get destroyed. You're going to get killed. Your family and friends are going to hate you. And you're going to die for my name's sake. The Jews in Jerusalem, they're going to have to flee to the mountains. And man, I feel sorry for women that are with young children and feeding them and taking care of them, because it's going to get ugly. That's talking about the Roman collapse. But then he's also talking about a similar thing, and this is where that's going to happen prior to his second coming in Jerusalem. And this is where we get into this abomination of desolation. And I know I'm all over the place, and I love it. It makes sense to me, but it probably doesn't make sense to anybody else. But here we go. Now, this is what's so cool about Joseph Smith's translation of Matthew 24 in the Pearl of Great Price, is that he clarifies the abomination of desolation by providing it twice, saying that there's going to be the abomination of desolation in a short period of time. So let's say it's 33 AD, some will say 34, some will say, whatever, but let's just 34 AD. Well, 40 years later, less than 40 years later, is going to be the total wipeout of Jerusalem. So here we go. So this is Matthew 1, the Joseph Smith Matthew 1, which I don't know why they call it Matthew 1, but it is kind of a combination of a verse or 2, I think, in Matthew 23, and then Matthew 24. But here's what it says. For many shall come in my name. Let's see. And Jesus left them and went upon the Mount of Olives. And as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him privately, saying, Tell us, when shall these things be that thou hast said concerning the destruction of the temple, the Jews, And what is the sign of thy coming, of the end of the world, or the destruction of the wicked, which is the end of the world? Now, see, that's an interesting phrase there, because the apostles are thinking that the destruction of the wicked is the end of the world. For me, this is just my opinion, Christ, the destruction of the wicked, the big bulk of the wicked, the destruction of the wicked will be his coming, his second coming. And I guess in a sense, that's the end of the world. I call it the end days, or the last days of wickedness, because for all intents purposes, wickedness is gone. Just good folks left. We're not going to have bathing suits, women bathing suits for dudes that still have the package. We're not going to have that during the millennium, in my opinion. Okay. Sorry. Okay. And Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no man deceive you. So I'm in Joseph Smith, Matthew 1, Pearl of Great Price. It's right after the book of Abraham. And Jesus said, okay, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Then shall they deliver you up. He's talking to his apostles. They're going to deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you. This is talking about those apostles right there. Christ is telling them, they're going to kill you. Can you imagine how intimidating that would be? And ye shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. Check, check, check. And many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that remaineth steadfast and is not overcome, the same shall be saved. Now, verse 12 is really interesting. When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, then you shall stand in the holy place. And the footnote for holy place, you go to the Doctrine and Covenants, section 101, 22 through 25. It's the temple. Whoso readeth, let him understand. Then let them who are in Judea. Now, Judea would be Jerusalem and kind of the southern part of Israel, and then down towards the Dead Sea and the Jordan River. And what this scripture says is, then in those days shall great tribulation on the Jews and on the inhabitants of Jerusalem, such as one is never set upon Israel of God, upon Israel of God since the beginning of their kingdom, and until this time no ever shall be sent again upon Israel. So it's talking about, I messed up. Okay, let me go back to verse 13. Then let them who are in Judea flee into the mountains. The mountains is Samaria, more of the northern part of Israel, central to northern. Let him who is on the housetop flee and not return to take anything out of his house. Neither let him who is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and unto them that give suck in those days. It's going to be tough. And it was tough. It was tough. 70 AD, that time period, the Romans just annihilate them. They destroyed the temple. Now, we'll come back to this, but let's go to Matthew 24, because this gets into a little bit of a controversy about where the temple was. So in Matthew 24, and Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came to him to show him the buildings of the temple. Very key, the buildings of the temple. So you have the Temple Mount, you have the temple, but there are other buildings and courts, right? Okay. This was the expansion of the original Solomon, and then rebuilt when Cyrus of Persia, when he conquered the Babylonians, he let the Jews and actually encouraged them and financed them going back to Jerusalem, rebuilding their temple. They rebuilt Solomon's temple. It wasn't as nice and fancy and everything, but it was still basically Solomon's temple. Herod comes along prior to Christ's birth, and he's a builder. He is a builder. Amazing that way. Very crazy and evil man, but a great builder. He expanded the Temple Mount, made it huge, and the old temple was still there that had been rebuilt during Ezra's time and that time period, when Cyrus and subsequent Persian kings who had conquered Babylon allowed them and wanted them to come back to Jerusalem. Herod didn't want to offend the Jews, so he built the temple, the new temple, over on top of, and the old temple was inside, so it could still be accessed and still be there. And then he renovated everything, but he expanded the Temple Mount. Basically, you couldn't expand it anymore to the east because of the Kidron Valley. So the expansion went south towards the city of David, and west, and west, and a little bit north, actually, but not east, right? So Christ, that's what he is looking at, this expanded Temple Mount, huge Temple Mount, new temple, relative, and beautiful. And Christ, and the apostles are saying, look at the buildings on the Temple Mount. And Christ says, not one stone will be left on another of those buildings. Okay? So some have argued, there's a guy named Carnucci, I can't remember how his, and he actually got this from a guy, his last name was Martin, and they feel like that the Temple Mount was, or the temple, Solomon's and Herod's temple, was actually in the city of David, which is just south of the Temple Mount. And, and one of the reasons is because the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall, where the Jews, it's the Jewish quarter where the Jews go to pray and they put their little prayers in the rock. I've been there many, many times. That the stones are stacked upon each other. So that couldn't be it. That couldn't be the place. So it has to be the city of David. Well, it doesn't take too much to figure out. That is the wall of the platform. It wasn't the building. And the Jews know that themselves. The reason why they worship at the Western Wall, it's the closest place they have access to. That was the closest place to where the temple was, on top of the Temple Mount. So the Western Wall is just the wall of the platform that Herod expanded. You can see the Herodian stones. You know that those stones are at the time of Herod, and in how he expanded that Temple Mount. It's amazing. The stones that were pushed off of the buildings, pushed off from down on the from the Western Wall, they were covered up until like the 70s, 80s. It was just dirt and rubble, and they started uncovering, and now you can go to the southern part of the Western Wall, and you can see these massive stones and how they pushed them off somehow, some way, and they came crashing down on streets and plazas below and just smashed things. It's there to see. It's there to see. You can actually see Hebrew, a stone of Hebrew writing of where the person would blow the trumpet from on top of the Temple Mount for different celebrations, different holidays, different sacrifices and whatnot. That they found that stone written in Hebrew for temple worship ceremony type things. So it's pretty hard. There's so much other stuff, but many of these people have that replacement theology in their head, where the Jews have been replaced by Christians. So as far as the covenant, so God, his covenant with Israel is no longer, it's now with the Christians, because of what the Pharisees and the nut jobs did to Christ at the time. So they lost their opportunity, if you will. They lost their chance, and they got replaced. Well, the scriptures don't bear that. Christ says, I'm coming back to my people and they will recognize me. And I've thought of this, just as we as Latter-day Saints have a connection, and really the restored keys, the covenants of the temple, we go back to Joseph Smith. That's who they were restored through. To me, it's the same with the Jews or the children of Israel. We don't have a covenant without the children of Israel, just like we don't have a covenant without Joseph Smith. To me, it's just that simple. Where others feel like it's been replaced. So when you have a replacement theology amongst Christians, then what you would say is the Jews have no right to the Temple Mount. So therefore, there could be another place where the temple was, and the future temple could be built. Others feel like there's no need for another temple because our bodies are the temple. And I've done a bunch of videos on that kind of stuff. Okay, so the buildings is really what I wanted to focus on, and I got off on a little sidetrack. Okay, and Jesus said unto them, see not that all these things, verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. And they are the buildings on the Temple Mount, as said in verse 1. So, and that happened. That Temple Mount was flattened. Now the Dome of the Rock, the Muslim, it's not a mosque. It's a shrine. And I think it was built around 600 and something AD. So in Israel terms, it's fairly new building, right? Okay. But there is some really good. Now, David purchased the threshing floor from Ornan the Jebusite. And the Ark of the Covenant was in the city of David, no question. But when the temple was finally built by Solomon, David's son, through Bathsheba, it says that they took the ark out of the city of David, up and out, and into where the temple is. So the city of David wouldn't be where the temple was. Certainly, though, the Ark of the Covenant was there. And this is where David's like, gosh, I have a palace, I have all this stuff, and yet the Ark is in a tent or in a cave or in a hiding, it needs a temple. And Jehovah agreed, but said, you're not going to be the one that builds it. It'll be your son. And so up where David had purchased the threshing floor, which would have been up and on a hill where the wind would blow and blow the chaff away, and as the kernels of wheat were run over, then the thrash would be blown away and the kernel would be left, right? So it was a smooth surface. Now, interesting thing. I tried to get inside the Dome of the Rock, my son and I did, and we got escorted out really quick. It just isn't, it's not a place that we're allowed to. But I've seen pictures, I have pictures of the inside. There is a place that looks like it could be the dimensions of where the Ark of the Covenant could be. And most Jews feel like that is where the temple was. However, just north of the Dome of the Rock, there's a canopy, and I saw it this time and I took pictures. I loved it. There's a smooth surface of bedrock just north of the Dome of the Rock. And that smooth surface of bedrock that has a gazebo kind of thing over it, to show that it's just to protect the bedrock, just so you can see on top of Mount Moriah, incidentally, where Abraham was asked to sacrifice Isaac, which is really cool because it ties so much in, and it would mean, it has so much meaning as to why the temple would be there. And it's actually part of the mountain where Christ was crucified as well. So it all makes sense, right? It's all there. Now, that exposed bedrock just north of the Dome of the Rock on the Temple Mount lines up perfectly with the Eastern Golden Gate, the Mercy Gate, that is directly across from the Mount of Olives. So, it's awesome. There's a really good book that really talks a lot about this theory. I'm trying to see if I can find it in my library here. Yeah, here it is. Really good book. It's called The Temple Revealed, and it's by Josh McDowell. Oh no, that's the forward. It's by Christian Widener, PhD. Christian Widener, Widener, Widener. And it's called The Temple Revealed. And that's it right there, if you're watching this. It describes that. It's really cool. And having been there, taking pictures and lining it up, it's really awesome. So back to this. I'll tell you, having been to these places several times, having been on the Mount of Olives, right on top, looking over to Jerusalem, and visualizing Christ teaching telling his apostles about what's going to happen. Now, let's go back. Okay, so I know I'm all over the place, but in Matthew 24, we have one reference to the abomination of desolation. And to me, this appears to just be talking about what's going to happen at 70 AD, right? Now, if you go to Matthew 1, Joseph Smith, Matthew 1 in the Pearl of Great Price, we read this. So let's go back up to verse 14, or no. So we've talked about, to flee. If you're in Judea, flee to the mountains or Samaria. Get away, get out of Jerusalem, get up into the mountains. And woe unto the woman that has a child and all that kind of stuff. For in those days shall be great tribulation on the Jews and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem, such as was not before sent upon Israel of God since the beginning of their kingdom until this time, no, nor ever shall be sent again upon Israel. Okay, now this was basically their utter destruction. Now in Judea and down, you had the holdouts, the rebels on Masada, and the Romans finally got them. They built a ramp. I've been on Masada three times now, and you can see still the Roman fortresses because it's such an arid place. Everything is just kind of preserved. and where really these Jewish rebels held out, and only one committed suicide. You know, it talks about a mass suicide, but only one did, because once they realized that the Romans were going to breach, and it was one of Herod's palaces sitting on top of Masada, overlooking to the east the Dead Sea, and the ramp came from the west side that the Romans built. Huge undertaking. And they had everything they needed up on top of there to last for quite some time. But once they realized that the Romans were going to come, they were not going to be ruled by Romans. So what they decided is they found on pottery pieces names of individuals. It was like you drew your lot, and what happened is each leader of a family would take the life of their family, and then this guy would then take the life of the head of that family as well as his others, and it went on and on and on until it was just one guy left that took his life. So that's kind of interesting. One guy takes his life, the rest took lives. See? The reason why we know about this event was that there was a woman and I think some children that were left to tell the tale that had no husband. That's how it's told. And then they were able to tell this story of what happened. It's pretty amazing. They've done excavations up there. You can see how they lived, how they survived, as well as how Herod, his palace, it was really something. So the first abomination of desolation was the destruction of Jerusalem. And why? Because they desecrated the temple. Now you could say, well, didn't Caiaphas and all those priests desecrate the temple? In a sense, yes, but where did Christ teach? Where did the apostles teach? They went to the temple. You can see that over and over. Christ first calls it what? His Father's house. Then he calls it his house. So, but the Romans put their palace or something on top of there. They desecrated it. They sacrificed, weird animals and did weird stuff there on the Temple Mount to desecrate it. I like to call it like it is in Daniel. Instead of the abomination of desolation, it's the desolation. It's the abomination that makes desolate. It's causing something so disgusting to our Heavenly Father that he wipes it out, kind of like a flood, kind of like a fire, destruction, right? That's the abomination of desolation. Now, back to, so we have that in Matthew 24. Well, then it gives, so Matthew 24 kind of sounds a little confusing. So is Christ just talking about that time period? And then when is the jump to the next period? Well, Matthew 1, Joseph Smith version helps us out with that. So I'm going to now skip to that. So in Matthew 1, the Joseph Smith version in the Pearl of Great Price, so he talks about the tribulation. Behold, these, verse 21, and these things I have spoken unto you concerning the Jews, and again after the tribulation of those days which shall come upon Jerusalem, if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe him not. So even after this destruction, that's not going to be the second coming. And then we go through verse 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27. And actually, I'm going to start in verse 27. And now I show unto you a parable. Behold, wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. So likewise shall mine elect be gathered from the four quarters of the earth. I think it's kind of funny to think of the elect as vultures looking down at some dead animals and, hey, we're going to gather there. I kind of like that, actually. I think that's good. And there shall, because it's a visual. We were in Morgan the other day at our one of our grandsons' graduation from preschool. It was awesome. But we were sitting there in the parking lot and we saw like 3 or 4 vultures in a tree. And they were all perched there. And I'm like, gosh, look at those vultures. Or I think my wife actually, I think Sue actually pointed out, look at those, what are those birds? You know, I said, those are vultures. And one by one, they just kind of came out from nowhere. And they came, and there were dozens of them that just flocked to this one particular tree. It was really, really bizarre. So there must have been something dead. Anyway, okay. They weren't eagles, these were vultures. But eagles be gathered together, so likewise shall mine elect be gathered from the 4 quarters of the earth. And they shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. Behold, I speak for mine elect's sake, for nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There shall be famines and pestilence and earthquakes in diverse places. We've talked about this before, but diverse places is really interesting because that means different places or unique places. How would we know that there were earthquakes in diverse places without the information highway? So this is talking about our time period, in my opinion, when it says earthquakes in diverse places, because there's always earthquakes, right? And this is usually the argument with this. There's always been wars and always earthquakes, but not in diverse places because we wouldn't have known it. We know it now instantly when there's an earthquake. Boom, just like that. And there's pictures and there's video and news coverage and everything. So now we're transitioning from the destruction of Jerusalem 70 AD by the Romans, and we're going forward now. And now these are the signs that precede Christ's second coming, and all these wars and kingdoms and earthquakes and all that. And then verse 30, and again, because iniquity shall abound. This is where we're at now. Iniquity is abounding. It's depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts, mass murders, all this stuff, drugs, open borders, confusion of who you are, pronouns, all that stuff. Iniquity shall abound. The love of men shall wax cold. We could do a whole video on what that means, but the wax cold. But he that shall not be overcome, the same shall be saved. So if you don't get overcome with the world and all it's thrown at you, with all their fake, phony, goofy, weird AI crap, if you can stand strong by studying the Word, feeling the influence of the Holy Ghost on a daily, regular basis, you'll be able to withstand this. And you'll be saved. And then listen to this. And again, verse 31, this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come, or the destruction of the wicked. And again shall the abomination of desolation, spoken of by Daniel, be fulfilled. That is the key. There's going to be another abomination of desolation, or an abomination that makes desolate. And this is, to me, this is the Ezekiel war, Ezekiel 38 and 39. This is what we read in Revelation, Revelation 13 specifically, where another time period of a holy site being desecrated, made desolate. And by that happening, then all these things all these things come to pass. Now, there's a ton of stuff in here. I'm going long on this, and I apologize, but we'll talk more about this next week, but I just wanted, and it's not that I wanted to ignore the current reading that we're in, but I did want to tie in that wedding. So now here we are. Now we're back to this wedding. We're back to who is the bride. We know who the guests are. We know who's been invited as guests. We've been told by a modern prophet, President Kimball, that the bride, or excuse me, the virgins represent the church, members of the church. So 50% are going to be out going, dang, I got to get some oil, and the other are going to be ready. Their lamps are going to be trimmed. Right? We talked about that, where the wick is trimmed so it gives off the most light possible. If you have a goofy wick, it's ineffective. So that's where the virgins are trimming their lamps, right? They're trimming their lamps. And I've shown this before. I have this in another room, but you have the small lamp. Even the foolish virgins had oil in their lamp. It's the extra oil in the little vase, that's what they didn't have to fill it as the waiting, anticipation, midnight. We can go through all the analogies of a Jewish wedding, which Elder Bednar did with this other parable, but the Jewish wedding and how the groom is really told by the father when it's time. You've built your home, you've done all your stuff. Okay, now you can go get your bride. And it's usually like at midnight and, at the anticipation. Nobody knows for sure exactly when it is. There's all these comparables. But then we go, well, who is the bride? Now, here's my thought. I said this right at first, and I teased you all this long, and I almost forgot to even bring it up again. But here's my thought. The bride is the organization or the keys that give structure to the organization, the authority, the priesthood authority to perform sacred ordinances. That is what the marriage is. That's where Christ takes over. That's where he marries it. And it's no longer given to individuals. It's his now. And then we, as members of the church, are the guests. So the church are the keys. That's where it makes sense to me. It's by keys, and we use in the church, we use that kind of, we just throw that priest of keys, priest of this, priest of that. But those are essential and dispensational, and all that can come together. We talk about it at Abomination. That's in scripture. That's spoken of by Daniel as well, which is kind of interesting. He not only talks about the abomination of desolation in Daniel, I think it's in 8, 9, and 11 or something like that, the abomination. But then we talk about the event at Abominations, where this marriage happens between Christ and key holders of dispensations. That to me is the marriage. That to me is the man and the woman, Christ, the groom, the keys, or the structure of the church. Without keys, nothing. It's just a nice, cool, like any other, it's kind of neat, they got some cool stuff going on. But without those keys giving structure and authority, it's the Peace Corps. It's just another church, So that's, to me, is the marriage. And then we, as individuals, can participate in the marriage of that. And by participate, we get blessed by that union. We get blessed by that union of Christ and the seven dispensations coming together, and that union, that marriage happening, and then we, if we choose, can be part of that wedding, of that union. So that's my theory. Love to hear yours, but be careful, because you cannot, in my opinion, you cannot say that the 10 virgins are the bride. They're not. And so the church, the members of the church, aren't the bride either. I think it's the keys. Okay, so I've taken over an hour. If you've suffered through this whole thing, you're just very, either have time to do it, or you're just kind to put up with this. Have a blessed day. Enjoy the influence of the Holy Ghost. Attend the temple every time you can. I'll tell you, soon I went, and it had been a while since we had gone to the temple. She'd been full-time caregiver for over a month, and I have no excuse. Our temple was closed for a period of time. We went to one other temple before Sue left, and then I'm looking down and I'm doing this. I have no excuse. I didn't go. It's not that I don't mind going alone, but I'd much rather go with my wife. And I don't know. I have no excuse. But I hadn't gone for over a month until a couple of days ago, and learned some really cool things. One thing I learned in Hebrews, I've learned this before, trust me, but in just studying the death of Christ on the cross, and the veil of the temple was rent, we have an understanding of what that veil represents, and we can read about it in Hebrews. But now think of this, that we gather scattered Israel on both sides of the veil. And what does the veil represent? Think about that. We'll talk about that later. Love y'all. Talk to you soon.